Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers. I'm the Director of City Planning. Welcome you to our third and final community meeting. I'm just going to jump right into our presentation. I have Brian Cook with the University of South Florida standing by to run through our presentation. Today, if you remember, the first meeting was to introduce the program and what we were going to try to accomplish in our project. We had a meeting a few weeks ago to go over the initial findings and what some of the ideas were coming forward. And today is to talk about the initial recommendations. These are just recommendations to the city. The city planning staff will take these recommendations after tonight and evaluate those for the actual next steps. So with that, let me bring Brian on board.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is our last presentation for this project. So for those of you that have been following along, thank you for the participation. And yeah, so a lot of work's gone into just understanding what are the policy options that relate to sea level rise. What are the impacts of sea level rise in Tampa? How do we create policies and regulation that fit the Tampa community needs and meet the specificity of geography and a place and community? So with that, I will get going here. Just a second. Okay, so I'm Brian Cook. I'm from the Florida Center for Community Design and Research at the University of South Florida. The Florida Center works in Tampa, Hillsborough County, but really all throughout Florida, and was established by the legislature to assist the citizens of Florida to create more livable and sustainable communities. And so we are excited to do that with Tampa for this project right here. Over the past, let's say, 3.5, 4 years, we've been really involved with coastal resiliency, sea level rise, storm surge issues, these kinds of things. And so, yeah, nice to be part of this project. So as our final public engagement opportunity here, workshop or meeting, this is coinciding with our final report. So what you see in the middle of the screen there is the final report, and that will be available. On either side are companion documents that will go along with this final report. One is an illustrated guide for sea level rise policy, and that'll describe visually some of the policy options that communities have when facing sea level rise. And then a subset of that is the homeowner's guide or best practices manual, which highlights some of the things that homeowners and property owners can do or should consider for themselves when thinking about sea level rise. So as we were putting this the reports together and going through the project, this line stood out a little bit, and it's in the beginning part of this report, this last report. So I thought I'd share it here. James Titus says, in the next century, the majority of America's publicly owned tidal shorelines could be replaced by a wall, not because anyone decided that this should happen, but because no one decided that it should not. And I think with sea level rise, this is a slow and incremental thing. And over time, people are adjusting and adapting. But I do want to commend the city of Tampa in taking these first steps and trying to do this as a community, not just placing it all on just individuals. And that as a community, maybe we can take a proactive approach and think about what things can be done and consider what our communities might look like in the future in a more coordinated way, not just in an incremental sort of haphazard way. So this last, the overall report, the overall project, and this last report It does present recommendations, but they are just that. They are recommendations only, not to be enacted into policy. It's part of the study, which will then go to city council and your representatives. And ultimately, the recommendations will probably go through a process of comprehensive planning and further community engagement. But just know that these policies are not going to be written right into law. So with that set up, just go through and review a little bit of the front part of the project here, which was analysis. So what we're showing here are the sea level rise projections based on the Climate Science Advisory Panel, which was formed by the Tampa Bay Regional Resilience Coalition. And this last set of projections was published in 2019. And so within that chart, we're using really 6 scenarios, but then sort of condensed down into 4 scenarios. And so that would be the year 2045 with the intermediate scenario, which is 1.26 feet. And these are heights from the year 2000. 2045 high, which is very similar to the 2060 intermediate projection, the 2060 high or the 2100 intermediate projection, and then the 2100 high scenario of 8.5 feet, which is obviously the most drastic. And I'm not going to read this all to you, but a lot of times when I'm talking about this subject, people wonder which projection should we be using. So take a screenshot or save, you go back to the video of the presentation. But this is what the community's, the Climate Science Advisory Panel puts in their report as far as what to expect in terms of which projections are most likely. And really the takeaway here is that it relates significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. At least that's what they're correlating these different trajectories to. So greenhouse gas emissions play a large part. And then obviously we'll have to monitor as time goes on to see what the actual increase in sea levels are. And then this is what those 4 scenarios look like here in Tampa. And 2045 intermediate is really not much affected. The lands that you are seeing there in blue are really open space and vacant lands, a lot of them publicly owned. And then moving through the progression to the highest impact, you can see the places that are most affected. So in doing that analysis, one of the things we came across is that there's really 4 spatial characterizations of places. And I think this can help and determine ways of approaching regulatory policy. So there are dispersed areas, so places where there's intermittent structures that are affected by sea level rise. And obviously this is with the most extreme projection, but this also correlates if you pull back on it a little bit. These are the lower lying areas that would be affected by flooding or whatever trajectory of long range sea level rise that we are choosing. But showing the most serious scenario sort of gives a perspective and a way of starting to analyze the spatial arrangement of places that are affected. So besides the dispersed properties, there's clustered areas or clustered properties. These are areas with what I call, they have a deep middle, which sort of affects the infrastructure and access for a place, and considering if that was permanently flooded, how would that affect that area? And maybe even considering how would a community adapt or respond to that kind of condition. And then there's linear areas or linear properties, which are strips generally found along the coastlines. And then saturated properties, which are areas that are significantly inundated in a very wide dimension, which would have a fairly serious and significant effect on a community, including the infrastructure that it uses. So We started to break it down in those 4 categories, and I think that can play a role into how to consider regulatory approach. So those maps are for the projections of permanent flooding based on the 4 scenarios. Now, something else to consider is that before a place is permanently inundated or permanently flooded from sea level rise, there's that leading edge. And throughout the course of the year, we have higher tides in certain parts or times of the year. And so those higher tide times can also flood areas of our community. So this was taken from a study by Stephen Fernandez, who's also helping us out on this project last year in the Shore Acres neighborhood. One of the things you can see here also is that sea level rise is not encroaching from the edges, at least in this community. And that's something to consider, is that as sea levels rise, so does groundwater, and that groundwater pushes up through the sewer systems, the stormwater systems, and can actually come out of those pipes and flood streets. So anyways, we took that data from that study and transposed it into Tampa. And so what you can see are the areas in the darkest blue, 0 to 2 feet. Those were the areas that flooded. That is a correlating elevation of what flooded in Shore Acres last year. So 0 to 2 feet could potentially be expected to have that seasonal or that extreme high tide flooding throughout the year. And then the other 2 ranges that we chose to analyze here, the 2.1 to 3.5 feet. So we're trying to look at future sea level rise and how long until certain areas start to also experience this more temporary or seasonal flooding. So this map kind of can give an idea of those different scenarios. And so again, like I said, sea level rise is not only at the coast, it's also coming through the ground. And so there's multiple effects. It's not just shorelines, which is a big issue to consider. But you also have subsurface soils, effects on plants and infrastructure, utilities that are underground that could potentially be affected, including roadways and the road base, things like that. So there's a whole array of effects. And really, when you think about it in this way, you can see that a seawall doesn't necessarily become the most mitigative structure, right? If the water is raising kind of across the board, that seawall structure is good for those storm surges or when you have that kind of effect off the coast. But with sea level rise and groundwater rise, it's sort of a uniform it spans across the terrain. So then types of policy, we tried to understand what types of policy are there that can be used in order to create regulatory options here. And that we boiled that down to citywide policy, which is generally related to overall systems that may affect sea level rise. So thinking about more like greenhouse gases or even inland areas and the planning of those for creating more density and more livable space out of these flood areas. FEMA flood zones, which relating back to the difference between, say, well, I was speaking about seawalls, the flood zones are really based on those sort of storm surge and rain events, which are temporary. And sea level rise being different, I mean, it may be temporary on occasion in these yearly events or seasonal events, but once sea level rise is present and permanent, it creates somewhat different conditions than FEMA flood zones or the way we treat FEMA flood zones. And then this idea of overlay zones, which there are many of them throughout the city. We have special zones for, say, the Channelside District or Ybor City. So we are using overlay zones in general. And then maybe overlay zones are the way to correlate specific community needs and topographies to situations dealing with sea level rise. So we'll get to the key recommendations here. In our report, we boiled it down to really 10 key recommendations for the community. So one is building toward the future. In the research, it shows that most everybody is talking about a 50-year time horizon, and that'll be something that can be worked out through further community engagement with the community. But the key recommendation one is building towards that future, establishing what projection are we going to be using in planning and permitting and that kind of thing, and using that to affect the way we build, building towards the future. And that includes, I was talking a lot about groundwater. That includes subsurface components. Nice photo here from the Tampa Bay Times, looking at a drainage structure in the North Howard area. But yeah, thinking about the way the elevations that we're putting infrastructure at, and then also, for example, in Broward County, they created a future groundwater elevation map and are using that to help plan and permit stormwater ponds and things like that, so that as water is rising, with a certain target date in mind, that the required allocation of space is accommodated, and that we're not putting ourselves into a harmful situation in our future. Another possibility is to think about even FEMA flood zones, and in terms of building for a future, a possibility is to add a future sea level rise target on top of FEMA flood zones, and think about building towards that future with some of the structural considerations that go along with that for building. Number two key recommendation is establishing adaptation action areas. This is more for places that have more immediate concerns. So when thinking, or when looking at these this map that is identifying areas that may already be having seasonal extreme high tide based flooding, that one of the recommendations is to begin validating some of the findings from our sort of over high level GIS based study, and get into the field conditions and validate those findings. And there's funding available for doing projects like these from both the state and then also federally. So the next step would be to commission studies to field verify this data and to begin communication with these communities and start to develop plans and actions for moving forward. Number three would be to establish overlay zones. This seemed to be one of the best ways to meet the challenges of sea level rise within our communities, because it doesn't affect uniformly. Overlay zones may provide a way of both applying regulatory strategies that meet the goals of a particular neighborhood. Some neighborhoods may want to pay more money to create engineered response, and other communities may want to start to decrease density or participate in programs that can sort of alleviate their situation through creating more space within their community. So anyway, those things have to be decided and developed with the community, but defining these areas that have similar impacts, similar community characteristics, I think that's a first step in developing action strategies and moving forward. Just a second here. All right. Number 4, identify critical infrastructure and vulnerable utilities. There are many pieces of infrastructure that are not proprietary to our municipality, and so working with owners of those critical pieces of infrastructure and identifying where those things exist with a further assessment. I think that's a positive next step, and thinking about long-term solutions. Some of these more critical pieces of infrastructure, they're heavy and it takes a long time to be able to change or modify or adapt them. And so moving forward and beginning to plan those kinds of things and considering sea level rise is definitely the next step recommendation. And as part of that, considering critical infrastructure and vulnerabilities are both our historical or cultural assets, not just hospitals and things like that, but also considering our cultural assets and even our communities, the communities that live by the coast and what value they bring. Some are generational, living in a community for a long period of time and thinking about them as critical assets and starting to plan with them. Number 5 is promoting flexibility through landscape systems. I think that, so moving forward, so landscape systems, because there's such a wide variation between the future projections, being flexible is going to be key. And so trying to find and make and utilize flexible space at the edges will help to alleviate or mitigate future risk for storms or for sea level rise, with the added benefits of helping out with other flood situations or scenarios. So allowing space for this water to expand and over time monitoring how fast that is expanding and kind of gauging that and then moving forward in that kind of capacity, I think is that's a good approach in adapting our communities to sea level rise. And so next steps would be to commission studies to identify and prioritize sites, to assess existing coastal public space. There's potentially certain private property segments that may be willing to participate in conservation easements with incentives and things like that. So working forward in terms of creating this flexibility through landscape systems is a good next step. And this includes thinking about seawalls. Seawalls not being a great deterrent, but to sea level rise, and inhibiting the upland movement of habitats as water is rising. We are in peril of losing habitat and the value that it offers in terms of an ecosystem and keeping doing its job for nutrient reduction and for our obvious habitat value. Those kinds of things are important to consider as going forward. So trying to find those spaces. All right, key recommendation number 6 is evaluating the feasibility of transfer development rights program. Now this is seems to be a very good and feasible opportunity. There is a program already set up, although the frameworks have not been fully fleshed out in Tampa. But this also so basically the transfer development rights sets up sending areas, which are areas that where you're trying to remove density, and then also setting up receiving areas where you'd like to promote density within the city, oftentimes linked to access to jobs, transportation, commercial areas, things like that. There's also cultural or social benefits of these situations where maybe there's a possibility to add incentives over the top of the properties in the sending areas so that when purchased, it can translate into increased density, bonus opportunities, or other incentives that make the value sort of trade-off and supports those people living in areas where they are wanting to get out of a bad sort of situation, but don't necessarily have the financial means and are concerned about property as their number one financial asset. So by layering over the top of those areas with certain incentives, it can also help people living in those areas. Number 7 is considering rolling easements. So rolling easements are a way of establishing, same as a conservation easement, so that could be purchased, or similar to a transfer development rights, could be purchased by a developer and then transferred to the municipality. But as water is coming up over time, and again, we don't know the exact time period that these things are going to happen, and it is slow and incremental. So programs could be established through this rolling easements type strategy, so that as that seasonal high water line moves up, there are so the places that are identified that may be in these areas could be offered an opportunity to be purchased through conservation programs. That concert after going into that conservation program, in a reciprocal way, the person on that lot could stay, but then over time, and even adapt their structure over time. But eventually, whereas the seasonal high water line may be something that is able to be adapted to, and we can deal with water coming up for, say, a few days a year. When the ultimate mean high water line overtakes a structure, then it would be time to go, and the structure would be removed and put into permanent conservation for the municipality. To go along with this, if desired, it could also operate in a way where if a area is planned to create this sort of easement, a certain financial incentive could be offered in the beginning. And if a property owner doesn't want to go along with that, they don't see the risk, they could forego that and stay as long as they want. But then the way that could also work is then it would then decrease over time, so that there's sort of a correlation with risk expectancy and sort of buyout, I guess. Okay, recommendation number 8, education and information. Education is extremely important, not just in sort of the overall topical sort of way of learning about sea level rise, but also in property transfer. If you're going to buy a house, it would be good to understand what risks you are taking with that type of purchase. And there are communities such as Broward County and others that are using certain types of disclosure policies that if a property is situated within a particular kind of zone that has been established by the community, then that is communicated through the sale of property ownership. Now, this, again, is not something to go right into policy, but is something to consider and be further discussed with the community, with the business community, with homeowners, thinking about future purchases of properties and what kind of strategies do we want to have in place so that we're making educated decisions going forward. Big one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Climate Science Advisory Panel does create a correlation with the efforts put towards reducing those emissions and the levels of sea level rise. And obviously, if the levels do not increase greatly, then we have a lot less to worry about. Now, we can't, this isn't a one-to-one thing. This is a kind of a holistic, community-wide or worldwide effort, but we are one piece of the puzzle. So trying to make that puzzle complete and to focus on that issue, we can also do our part there. And as part of that, say thinking about tree canopy, habitats, thinking about seagrasses and marshes and those kinds of things that are great carbon sinks, building strategies, all of those are described more fully in our report and are things to consider with greenhouse gas emissions. And City of Tampa is actually doing a greenhouse gas emission study currently, actually through with the Florida Center. So something to consider there. And number 10 is planning the city of the future. Some of these programs, such as, say, the transfer development rights, they only work to alleviate situations on the coast if the inland areas are planned. So knowing where we want to put density in the future will help to establish density bonuses, which can be layered over the top of coastal properties that we are trying to assist homeowners in sort of getting their value out of through density reduction programs and strategies. So thinking about this holistically, and even say when we're talking about density, that kind of relates to transportation also, right? Connecting land use and transportation. And then even that then has a relationship to greenhouse gases, getting people to walk and bike and be less automotive, less greenhouse gas emitting people. So anyways, planning the city of the future is kind of this holistic lens and thinking about how it's all going to be tied together. And that would be key recommendation number 10. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and comments and let Randy moderate.
Thanks, Brian. I see a question by Ron Weaver.
Brian, thank you for a great job. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes. Ron, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Randy. Great job. I was wondering about the transfer of development rights and the rolling easements and the person who forgoes some of the opportunities offered along the way. Is there any consideration of creating some kind of a facilitated, incentivized bank where you could create a market in those credits so that owners wouldn't just be at the mercy of find no buyer, have no other land for it, meaning it's totally worthless, as we've seen in dozens of cases around Florida, where they technically have on paper maybe a bunch of such transfer development rights, but they have no market and they have no property in a receiving area, and therefore, unless they have a facilitated, incentivized, in effect, making of a secondary market for those rights, the rights often are totally worthless.
Creating a mitigation bank or a transfer development right, creating a bank type of strategy is described somewhat. And what you're talking about, I think, is exactly the opportunity. There are people that are, consider if you're like third generation in a house from a working waterfront community and you didn't buy the house, but you have this coastal property, and you're no longer part of a working waterfront community, work somewhere else inland, your job doesn't rely on that, you may not have money to move out of that, or even to make modifications to your property to sort of adapt to the situation. By layering over the top density bonuses and financial rewards for people to purchase those properties and then put it into either conservation or whatever, I think it's a way of alleviating the homeowner peril of losing their greatest asset, right? And then especially if we're considering where those types of people, like creating good housing situations within our communities, and maybe even provide a leg up for some people that are in a situation that they're in danger of, and they're having a lot of infrastructural issues, and they can't keep up with it, or in the future, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities with that, and I'll say there's one, there's two. Let's see. There's, I think his name's James Titus, is a great author about this issue, and he has one that's called Rising Seas, Coastal Erosion, and the Takings Clause, How to Save Wetlands and Beaches Without Hurting Property Owners.
Right.
And the other one is called Rolling Easements. And both of these are referenced in the final report. So, and if you want, you can email me and I'll send you the link. But a lot of good ideas in there.
Super. Is there also a possibility of eminent domain taking of property? Eminent domain taking of
usually,
property?
no. I mean, there are plenty of legal precedents that were against takings of properties. So, but these are things that ultimately they're to be sorted out, I think, within the community. But I would less expect takings.
And one last question is the sister, and then I'll shut up and let others ask questions. A third sister of this trio would be this. Are you familiar with the DOT Advanced Acquisition Program, where rather than paying eminent domain 25 or 30% legal fees, they go in and negotiate in advance for certain properties they're going to need for interchanges down the road, and they get them at an opportune moment where the seller is motivated. They buy them. They're called Advanced Acquisition Funds of the Department of Transportation. And I'm wondering if there were a similar program here where you could take areas where you'd be going ahead and buying properties and floodways that would be affecting other properties looking 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 years down the road, just like the DOT does in the advanced acquisition. You don't have to pay legal fees in eminent domain. You just go and find an opportune moment with owners. And in this case, it would be for properties and floodways that would affect properties.
Yeah, and it just comes down to planning. If you can identify where those areas are, I think that's really the first most important step. And then is working with the community to make sure that's the strategy that they want to go for, right? In those overlay areas, identify really the three options are to protect or to accommodate or to decrease density. So I think it's up to the community to decide which one of those they're going to do. If it's to protect, that's going to come at a cost, right? The same as if you're going to raise your seawall for storms, there's going to be costs associated with that. But yeah, and currently there are many programs. If the planning is in place, there are many programs to help with property purchase, sort of as you're discussing it, advanced acquisition at the federal level, state level.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Rick.
Ron, it's Randy Gores. I think the point that you bring up is a good one because as we've seen, the federal government and also the state government is now starting to pour quite a bit of new money into the issue of sea level rise. And as Brian alluded to, communities that have the planning worked out and have a strategy identified could be in the front of the line for much of that money that comes out. So creating a strategy that looks for property acquisition when property owners want to sell. Not everybody's going to want to sell at the same time, but just making it known that there are certain areas that we want to target, and we have a funding source could be very helpful. That's a good suggestion.
In pink on your next to last slide, in those areas for floodways in the pink on your next to last slide.
Oops. See if I can make it go.
Does anybody have any other questions?
Yeah, those pink, that one you just hit it.
I have a question from Gary Brown. You should be unmuted, Gary. But we don't hear you. Okay, we'll come back later. Is there anybody else that has a question?
If not, I guess we'll just chat with Ron all night.
Well, I can sort of let everyone know sort of what we think our next steps are going to be. And I think there's a few recommendations I know that we can move forward on. The education part in terms of letting the public know about the findings of the study and some of the ideas that are coming out of it, I think can be done fairly quickly. And we can begin rolling that out. We have it on our website. We have these videos, and we can begin communicating that information to the public over the next several months. The one big policy initiative is the idea of establishing that threshold for sea level rise planning. We have something already in the comprehensive plan about taking into account sea level rise in our planning and infrastructure decisions. But as Brian mentioned, some communities some of the best practices are looking out and establishing some threshold, whether it's 50 years or something similar, saying that's what we should be planning for today, is that 50-year time frame. We don't know if 50 years is the best time frame for Tampa. It could be 40 years, could be 60 years, but we want to take a look at what the scenarios say at 50 years and begin bringing that out and start asking ourselves, what does that mean in terms of land use decisions, infrastructure decisions, capital improvement planning? Can it be something that can be employed as a starter? We may have to start off a little bit less than that because of the impacts. But the way that would work is that at some established interval, I think, Brian, some of the best practices say every 10 years you recalibrate the policy according to that next 10-year increment. So it's a way of easing our way into those long range implications, and at the same time monitoring the rate of sea level rise, because these are projections based on today's information. We have to look at what's the actual rate, where is it actually showing up, and putting together the programs to address it. And then the other thing is to look at what is the legal, the social, the economic impacts of some of these more broader recommendations, the rolling easements, the transfer of development rights. In our minds, it makes sense when you're talking about a handful of properties, but when you start looking at large scale parts of the city that might be affected, it becomes a big challenge. And what is the actual implementation in the end game on that? So we want to take a look at what is the actual implications of those programs. Can they work over time, and when might they be employed? The other thing is Brian identified some areas will have targeted potential flooding from groundwater. May not be all the time, it may be seasonal. So if we can identify those and begin monitoring those conditions and be ready with some solutions, especially now as the federal government and the state government are providing funding for those for local governments. And then the other recommendation to begin thinking about is, we spent a great deal of time on this study. Almost all the study was involved on the area that would be affected by sea level rise. There's a great deal of the city that is not going to be affected by sea level rise through the 21st, early part of the 21st century. So there's an opportunity to begin looking at what the city might be like in the 21st century in planning for those types of, I guess it would be the 22nd century. I think we're in the 21st now. So it's really trying to look at what is the city like 100 years from now, and how can we plan for that in terms of encouraging more development to go in areas that won't be affected by sea level rise. And so those are some of the things I think we're going to be looking at over the next couple of years. Many of these these ideas will take, as I mentioned early on in the project, this really kicks off, I believe, just based on my experience, a couple of years of dialogue with the community and policymakers on what is the right way to go. Although I think some things can be implemented sooner than that. So with that, I'm going to make one last pitch. Is there any other questions before we break for tonight? I see one.
I'll add one real quick, and then we can go to that. For Ron's question too, if we consider every year we have this potential of disaster with hurricane season. So another thing to consider is in our post-disaster redevelopment plan also, we're fitting that into this whole mix of planning and property options. So
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a if by chance we are hit by a major catastrophe caused by a hurricane, the choices that we make in rebuilding fit in extremely well in terms of mitigating against future disasters and at the same time planning for sea level rise. So we do need to look at what choices should we make if a disaster were to hit parts of the city. Gary, you have a question? I see your mic's on, but we're still not able to hear you. Do you have a question in the question box? It says, does this take into account the new FEMA maps as far as the wave action in order to identify which properties would be impacted?
So I'm aware of the new FEMA maps, and they have that new Limwa line, which is the coastal A zone. I think that's what you're referring to. It is a new sort of a velocity zone, which will affect properties. However, our project doesn't necessarily get into storm surge. There's a lot to do just isolating sea level rise. So, and I touched on that the FEMA flood zones, maybe they correlate in terms of topographic situation, like the lower areas are more affected generally, but it is somewhat different strategies, I think, between the FEMA flood zones and maybe something that's more tailored towards sea level rise. So.
And Ron Weaver.
Real quick, back to the hurricane after. Hopefully we won't have any more, but since that's not Florida, it would be good to have the advanced acquisition fund question I asked about 5 minutes ago, to have a what if question so that you could go into certain areas and say, look, don't spend, $100 million here fixing back this area, and these 1,800 affected homes like Boca Grande had that many blue tarpaulins, on top of the roofs of Boca Grande after Charlie in 2005, is to go into that area and say, look, here's the incremental difference of you locating somewhere else, and we'll give you 30 grand to locate somewhere else instead of rebuilding your house at 150 grand or whatever, if that'll leverage you a new $150,000 house somewhere else, so that you'll save the rebuilding of that area and achieve some of what we just talked about.
Yeah, and that's a critical observation, because after disaster, FEMA's primary goal is to get the community back on its feet as quick as possible. And if a community does have that type of question or procedure already established, it allows the FEMA to maybe just slow its mission down just a little bit to be able to look at those options.
And some flood insurance policies are beginning to say not twice. You can flood insure the first storm, but not the second one of this property.
Good point.
Yeah, and I think I just want to add to that. That's one of the reasons I'm really big on this idea of overlay zones and planning through using these overlay zones, is because those decisions should be made, and the sooner the better, about which way is a community going to go into the future. Are they going to put up and protect and try to stand their ground and in the face of challenges, or are there going to be other strategies involved? And I think that you have to know what the community's goals and intents are going to be before you can make that decision about what to do, say after a storm, or where to spend money, or these kinds of things. So, and how to spend money.
Any other questions? I don't see any. So I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank Brian for all the work he's done on this project. You know, when we started this project, there was really just one question that we were posing to the state, because this was a very small grant, and all we wanted to know was when would sea level rise affect our land development regulations? Where would it begin to show up first? And what would we need to begin thinking about to prepare for that? And when you look at the depth of the information, and when you start looking at everything else that Brian delivered as part of the project, you'll see that he and the Florida Center went well beyond that mission and really provided us a depth of sea level rise analysis that we probably wouldn't have gotten definitely through ourselves and maybe through some other means. So I just want to thank Brian for the hard work over the last 6 months and working on this project and giving us, I think, a real good foundation for making some sound decisions in the coming months. I do see one question that popped up as I was lauding Brian's achievements.
Well, yeah, well, thanks, Randy. And it's been a pleasure to work with you. And we've had our team of followers in the administration. So,
Cynthia, let's see if I can get you unmuted.
Cynthia. Here. Hello.
There you go. You're unmuted, Cynthia. Seem to be having challenges with certain mics, I believe. She put a question in the box. When will the study be available to the public? We'll have it uploaded, and the study will be uploaded by the end of the week. All of the documents should be available by Friday. Some of them are already there on the city planning webpage. This video will take about a week for us to get it downloaded, processed, and uploaded. Okay, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us tonight. We appreciate your support over the last several months. We'll be able to stay in touch through the city planning webpage if you have any follow-up questions as we move forward. Thank you and have a great night.
Thanks.